The nurse in ICU told me they'd never seen so many visitors for one person because like ICUs are really depressing. People tend to stay away. Bearing witness to something like that, like fundamentally changes like your view of love too, which is like, how foolish would it be for me to complain when like I'm getting no matches on Hinge that I'm interested in? Like I'm going to die alone, when like you literally witness that like love doesn't really work that way, and that love is kind of already here in your life, like wherever you choose to place it, and putting like romantic love on this pedestal is probably a bit foolish.
When my grandma got married at the age of 19, abortion was still illegal. No-fault divorce wasn't a thing. She couldn't access contraceptives. She couldn't even open up a bank account by herself. Did she love my grandfather? Well, yeah. But what other choice did she really have? Love is, and always has been, a political question. Has secularism set love free, or is it meaningless without the church? Has feminism robbed men of their role as husband and provider? And what about the endemic loneliness and atomization plaguing people across much of the Western world? Who we deem as inherently unlovable, whether or not we think of ourselves as deserving, and what it is that people really need in terms of money and housing to be able to properly love each other, has massive implications for the politics that we live with. Shon Faye's new book, Love in Exile, is about love in all its forms, and why so many of us feel like failures in what's meant to be the most universal human experience of all. It's about how the very idea of love, what it means to love well, has shifted its shape throughout the ages. And this was a really enjoyable conversation, even though I'm still shaking off a bit of a cold. Shon Faye, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It feels like old times coming back to Novara.
I know. Is it like a little bit triggering? Are you like, oh God, I remember the bad lighting?
I was thinking about that. Like when I started doing, like, I did video content, like it's 10 years ago now. Like I remember like you and I probably met when we were both doing our sort of like zany video content. It's like the naivety of the mid 2010s.
Yeah, it was like I thought like you could be really minoritarian and that would be fine and have no consequences. And now I'm like, oh, some of the things that I said were a bit mad.
Yeah, I mean, I did a whole video that still people mention to me about the meaning of queer, and I've ended up the most basic bitch straight woman ever. So I'm like, yeah, it sounds great. It's not my life.
I was sort of like decolonize everything, and I'm like, well, I'm married to a nice white man, and I, live in my terraced house, like decolonize stuff, but later.
Yeah.
So your first book, The Transgender Issue, was a bestseller, and it was, I think, the best account of British transphobia that I've ever read, and in particular those chapters about British media culture, just fantastic. It's become a real touchstone for me in understanding the transphobic backlash in this country. So why follow up with a book about love? Is that you going, actually, fuck politics, I can't be arsed anymore, I need a break?
No, I think on the contrary, I think it was, for me, it came from the fact that a lot of my politicized experience felt very intimate, like it played out in my personal life. And like I was very interested in this idea of taking a topic that isn't considered political and talking about it on political terms. And like, I mean, like when you think about consumer capitalism, how much of that is actually about becoming more lovable or at least desirable to others, to yourself, like for men, for women, for anyone really. And so to me, I took the topic of love and it just seemed so rich in terms of where you could take it politically. So no.
I mean, what does it mean to be in exile from love?
Well, I mean, it began with this quite like a deeply individual view, which is that like my experience as a trans woman, right? Like the book starts, I give a little bit in order to bring people along. And so the book starts on a very personal note about like a specific relationship I had where I had a relationship with a man who was cis and straight. And I was around 30 when I met him, and I was like, this is it, I'm set. All the problems that I've been through are fixed now, and this is who I'll be. And I've like assimilated into being a heterosexual woman. And that worked for a little bit, although there were sort of glaring incompatibilities. The biggest one being that we had very different views on what the purpose of a relationship was. He really, really wanted to get married and have children, and I particularly don't want to have children. I've always been quite certain about that. And so that breakup was not just about a breakup with an individual person. It was about the shattering of this like fantasy I had about what my life was. And I felt very much in exile. I was like, I don't fit. I've been trying to fit into something that does not want me in it. And that wasn't about that person. It was about the institution, right? Which is like, it was after years and years of being told on dating apps, like, I don't know if I could date a trans woman. I want to have kids. I don't know if I feel comfortable with the idea. Like, it's quite obvious to me that I have dealt with a sense of exclusion. So that was the starting point. But what happened as I started to sort of generate ideas for the like chapters and the essays within is I realized like, you know, like this isn't specific to me or even to trans women. Like parenthood and family are a huge topic. Like, the birth rate is falling. Lots of women are choosing not to have children, can't find a partner to have children with, and feel deeply in crisis about that. And I also think like lots of men feel in exile from feeling desirable. I like, obviously movements like online misogyny around figureheads like Andrew Tate or incels or whatever, there's a complexity there. It's not just like, oh, the men are lonely and so they're really hating on women. But there is an element in which they've probably been socialized for something that they now feel they're being deprived of. And there's an anger and a resentment there.
I mean, so when it comes to, I guess, the way in which incels are framed, it's like, well, I'm being exiled from sex because, you know, women are gatekeepers of sex and they're not, you know, opening the portcullis to me. And there are women, heterosexual women in particular, who say, well, what I'm exiled from is love. Like, of course, I could have like, you know, 2.5 minutes of terrible sex with anyone I want, anytime I want, but that's not what I want. So are they both talking about the same thing, which is love, or are they actually talking about different things?
I think there's a couple of things going on there. It's an interesting question. I think, first of all, it's much more acceptable in terms of hegemonic masculinity to say that you want sex, not that you want love. Like, it's not masculine. And Bell Hooks writes really well about this in All About Love, that men can't even articulate that need. It's part of male socialization to say, you know, I need love. That's already, if you do that, you're stepping away from a traditional masculinity. The other thing is that sex for a lot, like in very classic sort of like straight masculinity, sex with women is a way that you show value to other men. You display it. Like, it's more for the attention of other men. So arguably there's even a desire for a love relation there with other men, which again is something.
Okay, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick.
Well, there is, right? Like, it's like, you know, there is a deep, like, affective, like a desire for an effective bond with other men. So like, yes, I think men are looking for love. I don't think it's exactly maps onto what women are saying when they say they're looking for love. But I also think there are flaws in what I think women are a bit incoherent. I mean, I'm making huge generalizations, but there can be in the sort of standard feminine heterosexual articulation of what women are looking for. There's this historical precedent that like no longer applies, which is you're looking for like love and affection and romance. But what that was always designed to do was lock you into a marriage where you say goodbye to your life. It's like the next like few decades are full of drudgery and like unpaid labor. And like women want more equal partnership and emotional reciprocity now. So that's often what they're arguing, or not arguing for, like looking for or feeling that they're lacking. But I think at the same time, like romantic fantasy has still got like a deep root in like in a lot of like women's self-fashioning of what they consider love to be.
I mean, for me, the really important thing about this book, and it goes through every single chapter, is that all of these things that we maybe think of as either deeply personal or individual or sort of like naturally emerging experiences are actually historically constituted. And, you know, earlier you referred to love as an institution. We're so used to thinking of marriage as an institution, but certainly not love. So what is the institution of love, and what are the sort of forces which are constructing it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Well, I think what I do in the book is I try and take, there's a chapter in which I take people through a potted history of like the idea that romantic love as we conceive of it now is actually very recent. It's like 200 years old. It's not that, because if you look in the ancient world, I talk about Plato would have talked about like, and Socrates would have talked about theomania, the idea that love is like a very Beyonce coded, like love is like a kind of crazy delusion, and it's actually like a libidinal force that's actually quite scary and like can lead to chaos, and it often does in Greek mythology.
Not me, Gav. Not me, Gav.
And yeah, and the idea that like marriage and love was really separate is there even throughout like medieval literature, right? Like this idea of idealized love that's adulterous and not the same as marriage.
Well, the courtly sort of lover, or like, you know, the knight who's doing like mad shit on behalf of a woman, that was always an adulterous relationship rather than the married one.
Yeah, exactly. That's I talk a little bit about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, right? Like that was a particular occasion of someone crossing over from this like very idealized romantic love, where he used to write her these like schoolboy type letters when she was like not putting out and like holding on for that ring. And then like he tired of it very quickly once she became a wife, because it seems that the ardor he had for her was very much in this tradition of adulterous kind of.
It's that famous saying, what happens when a man marries his mistress? He creates a vacancy.
Yes, it's true. Something I wish I had realised at certain points in my dating life. Anyway, aside from that, I think, so this is a very recent idea, and it's heavily bound up with economic shifts, actually, that especially during the Industrial Revolution. Well, there's two things going on. There's an artistic movement like Romanticism, which is essentially like the term soulmate, for example, is a Coleridge coinage. Like, to be happy in married life, you must have a soulmate. And so a lot of our modern ideas come from kind of that artistic and creative movement, the idea sort of that man is able to forge his own destiny, and that deep connection with nature, this idea that love is a spiritual transcendent force, and you'll know on instinct when you see them. And combined with that, though, is this like very unromantic industrialization that family units start to change, they start to shrink, and the family unit becomes a way to reproduce a particular kind of labor force. So there is a very specific point in time where love comes into being. And I think whilst that has obviously opened up and changed, I think the forces that shape love, you asked like what like love as an institution, right, is that like the state plays a huge role. So marriage and love do sort of go hand in hand. Nowadays, it might even be like long-term monogamy. It doesn't actually have to be that you go to a registry office. But this idea that like there is a normative way to do love, and that there's a lot of social stigma around people that don't fit into that. Like that model of like a long-term monogamous couple is part of the institution of love. The idea of like family raising and children, particularly for women, is part of the architecture of love. Heteronormativity, even if you're queer or gay, like the late 2000s, the whole like love is love, the whole modeling of like gay marriage, equal marriage, was about assimilation and being like, actually, we're not so different to you, which certainly probably had benefits, but also like restated this idea of a particular way of doing love. But when I say the state too, I mean, there's a chapter in the book on friendship and the love between friends. And like, you don't like around immigration and policy, even around our working lives, right? Like if my friend dies, I don't get compassionate leave from work. Like there is an assumption like deeply woven into our culture about which love matters. So I argue that sort of forms a matrix of like this institution called love, which I kind of describe as almost like this fortress kingdom, and therefore like exile is this feeling of being shut out. The irony being though that a lot of people look at it and feel shut out.
Or even people who are coupled in a very heteronormative way, and maybe, do have children and did get married and all this stuff, feel like exiles from it as well. Because it's like, well, this wasn't, I'm somehow failing to, always feel sexually attracted to my partner, or always feel romantically drawn to them, or feel fulfilled by them.
Totally. And then like, I think of like, Tori Peters' novel Detransition Baby, she dedicated that to divorced women. And when I interviewed her about the book when it came out in 2021, and I kind of asked her about that, and she said that divorced women most clearly mirrored her experience as a trans woman, because she was like, essentially, the process is somewhat the same. It's like you get to a certain point in life, leading it one way, and realize like, this is wrong, and I have to start over again. And that process of like, everything, the shame, the guilt, the sense of failure, the sense of like, I have to now build a life from scratch outside of what was told me would make me happy, she found that identification there. And that's the sort of connection that I think I'm interested in making in the book.
So in the intro, I talked about what the reality of love was like for my grandmother in the 1950s. So, she meets my grandfather, they get married, she's 19, but like abortion isn't legal. She couldn't access contraceptives from her doctor. It wasn't until the 70s that a woman could get a court order of protection against a violent husband. Marital rape isn't criminalised until the 1980s. No-fault divorce, not a thing. And the stigma attached to unwed mothers was just insane. So yeah, she fell in love with my grandfather, but like, what fucking choice did she have? What might it have been like during that same time for a transgender woman, or a woman who we would now call transgender?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because I it's something that I grapple with in the book, and there's a chapter about the women in my family, and really similar. Like my grandmother was got married was born in like 1920s Ireland, just after the creation of the Irish Free State, like deeply Catholic, conservative country. Part of the reason that my grandparents emigrated to this country was that my great aunt had a child out of wedlock and was placed in an institution, which she then like convinced my grandmother to take her out of, and the stigma was so great you just couldn't remain there. And no divorce. My grandmother was one of 12 children. So very similar. So my experience, right, doesn't, and then my mother was a single mother in the 90s, like during the like Major and Blair years where there was so much stigma. Yeah, I know. Well, I always feel like it's the same as when I listen to you and Moya talk on your podcast, because I just feel like I often find myself in life winding up with women with very similar patterns of single mothers. Anyway, so my experience, right, like I often am looking to some historical precedent that does not exist as a trans woman. The reality is there's lots of different factors: ethnicity, passability, whether you went through a medical route or not. But basically for trans women, there would have been, probably from the 60s onwards, the option to either go through a medical route and become as passable as possible. And some of those trans women would have got married. In fact, I interviewed a trans woman on a podcast I did a few years ago, who was on the precipice of getting married to a man, and then he found her documents and discovered that she was trans. And so like there was, you either had to kind of hope that you could convince someone that you were worthy on your own merit, and then maybe it would progress to a marriage, or you wouldn't tell them. Or the flip side, if that wasn't available to you for a variety of reasons, would be probably that, the proximity of trans women to sex work, and I think that's something that, whether a trans woman is doing sex work currently or not, still exists in relationship to men, is that historically we probably belong to this class of like secret, like the mistress class, right? And so some trans women might have hoped to have had basically some kind of regular arrangement with a cis man that would never have like publicly claimed to her as
sugar daddy.
Yeah, like a sugar daddy. Who put you up maybe in a flat if you were like really lucky. And I think those like basically a similar kind of dependence financially and socially on men, but with like a very different kind of stigma attached and far more precarious than the orthodox married cis woman.
I mean, so the thing that I guess like both of these situations have in common, I guess, when we're talking about trans women and cis women in the past, was that in order to live, by which I mean, financially sustain yourself and have a degree of economic stability that was entirely dependent on a man. That has now changed to, a huge degree. Like the economic basis of my marriage with my husband is so different from what my grandmother's was. It's almost hilarious. And for me, the question is, so then what does that mean for men? Because we look at it through the lens of what it means for women, that sense of autonomy, that sense of, well, I don't have to put up with this. I can deal with the pain of a divorce because it's not necessarily going to mean that I'm on the streets. What does it mean for men if it's like, okay, well, the thing I had to offer was you'd die without me. Now that's not true. So what does the changed status of men mean for the institution of love?
Well, that's such an interesting question, one I tried to tackle in the book, because there is a lot of talk about a dating crisis in general, but specifically with heterosexuals right now. Like, it's everywhere. It's all over my Instagram feed. And like, I find
the straights are in trouble.
Yeah. And well, I mean, people don't even afraid. They're just like, dating is really bad. Dating sucks. And people, what's funny is people will always say, oh, it sucks in London. And then like people in New York are like, it's really bad in New York. And I'm like, bitch, it's bad everywhere. But interestingly, like, that's what I find so fascinating, is that it's often framed as about being about the technology we use, like dating apps and this disposability culture. And I think that like plays a role, but I think it's overstated, because I think what I argue in the book is fundamentally, which affects men as well as women, is there is a crisis of expectation. It's like I touched on earlier, women, because they may have experience of greater degree of financial autonomy. And like, yeah, as a trans woman, I'm pretty much, like historically, it's strange. I belong to a particular generation of a particular kind of privileged trans woman. That means, I'm able to make my own money and not be dependent on men in that way, to the point where I can even now be a bit like, my career, I can be worrying about whether that's going to intimidate a man. I mean, that's quite a luxurious position even now. But this crisis of expectation is that, as I discussed, like, women have greater autonomy financially and in terms of social stigma, good thing. But that means that women, and I include myself in this, would like emotional reciprocity from a partner. They are looking for like life partnership, which is a tall order, because, people like Esther Perel always sort of talk about how we're expecting one person to provide what a village used to, essentially, like a confidant, your sexual partner, like co-parent, someone that you run your finances with. Like, it's a lot for life on a voluntary basis with no social conventional laws basically trapping you in it. But women are looking for that. And I think the problem for men is millennial men who are younger, have not been socialized often to provide that. But nor have they been like my grandfather, who would have understood his role, is that his role was to provide financially, to provide a home. That was what being an upstanding man was. And, if you were kind and gentle, that was a bonus. But like, men now aren't able economically to do that, especially working class men. Like, the reality is that there aren't those same, I don't want to say patriarchal spoils, because sometimes it's the bare essentials of living, but there isn't that provider role. There also, just isn't the same level of like housing, wage security, etc. Women, most households have to be two income. And they're also not raised, male socialization does not raise boys as a rule to speak in an emotional register that speaks to women, that like is able to provide that emotional reciprocity. And I think that's a crisis. I think both sides are looking for something. It's a huge generalization, but I think that there is a crisis of expectation there.
I mean, you talked about how we're socialized into this idea of what it means to love. I suppose my question is, who taught you what love was, and what was it that you learned from them?
That's something I address in the book, right? Because it's so easy to frame the book and the personal aspects of the book around my experience as a trans woman, but actually, I don't think it's the most relevant factor. I mean, like, I just talked about the fact that I was raised by a single mother. The book also talks about like the alcoholism in my family, and the fact that my father was an addict and disappeared from my life when I was 11. And like, my parents' marriage, like something like addiction, it infiltrates the whole family. My parents' marriage, and my mum has read the bits about her in the book, and I got it checked. So I'm gonna say this knowing that I think I've got permission to say it. It's like, my parents' marriage was like unhinged. Do you know what I mean? Like, so like, if we're talking like less politically, more at the psychological and psychotherapeutic level, like, in terms of, there's a lot of interest in attachment theory as one of the like various horoscopes we use, but like, realistically, our early life experiences and what our parents model to us and our relationships with our parents are, at the psychological unconscious level, what we often recreate with partners, often trying to change the ending. I believe that. And so for me, I had a particular difficulty in that, like, well, it's like a perfect storm. It's like my parents had this like very fantasy-based marriage that everything was going to get better soon, and it never did.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. And then it ended pretty catastrophically. And then, there's a parental abandonment that obviously I went to therapy in the end and realized like it's daddy issues. How annoying. Like, I love Lana Del Rey. Turns out it's daddy issues.
I mean, like you're joking about it. And I joke about it too. Yeah. I'll be like, how do you get this personality? Parental abandonment. But it's also not a joke. It's so, you have to make it funny because otherwise it's such a cliche to be like, I was deeply wounded. By the experience of my dad rejecting me. And that's stayed with me forever.
Yeah. And the thing is I realized, when I was looking back at some of the past relationships that I write about in the book, I didn't really share that. Like, I look back now as an older person, I'm like, why did my exes would try and bring up the fact that like the disappearing father, and I'd be like, I don't want to talk about that. That's fine. And it's like, but they're probably the people I should be talking about it with because there's going to be an inherent connection there. The other factor too is that, I had the particular experience, right, of like society very, very ineffectively trying to socialize me in a particularly normative male way that like at every juncture just wasn't working. And there was punishment that attended that. And I talk as well in the book about it's an odd experience to be a straight trans woman who is very conspicuously feminine and kind of treated as a gay teenager because I happen to have the unfortunate thing of fancying people whose like my first experience of was fear. And what does that do to one's like understanding of men and desire and your own desire for men? And particularly when you have the pivot of like literally it can be the same, you just feel like the same person, but because of like certain external changes, you become sexually desirable to people that like you retain a fear of. And I think all of that painted quite the picture.
Is that different from being a cis woman, though?
No, it's not different. That's the thing is I think I'm not saying it's a particularly unique experience. If anything, I think the reason I'm articulating is because that's so often denied of trans women. It's like we float through our childhood and teenage years having no experience. It is different, right? Like I didn't have the experience that like my sister might have had where she was like a preteen getting like catcalled by men. Like you don't have that experience. However, I did have experiences of very sexualized targeting. Like obviously it's done with this like irony, but it's still sexual harassment, right? So it's not different. I think but I think trans women perhaps like I felt somewhat alienated from that experience because it's not something I really spoke about. And I actually think it's a deep connection often between certain trans experiences. And I went to an all boys school, right, as well. So it was like I couldn't even fit in with I couldn't do the like Damien and Mean Girls thing where I fit in with a group of girls. It's like I was forced to play rugby for 3 years. I've got to like turn my like campy, wisecracking, bitchy sense of humor into like sarcasm and like survive for 7 years.
It's like, all boys school is my Gitmo. Like I just had to.
Well, I have friends with a few trans women who went to all boys school, and I'm like, we need our own support group within the, like alongside all the trans stuff. We need like survivors of boys school.
There was there's a chapter called The Pantomime in it, and you quote from someone called Maya Memi. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And what she says is, I don't think that all the guys that I fuck with consider me fully human in the way that they may consider other women fully human. And that made me think a lot about dehumanization, objectification, and sexuality. Because while I think that there is something very specific about the experience of trans women and that sense of being consigned to the shadows and something shameful, and men sometimes telling you to your face, like, you've got to be a secret because otherwise you're going to ruin my life. I think lots of people can identify with experience of having been objectified to the point of being dehumanized, even by people who you're very, very attracted to, maybe even people you're in a relationship with. And so I guess my question for you is like how, this sort of triangle between sexual desire, objectification, and dehumanization, like how are you meant to navigate that without feeling really afraid? Because objectification is a part of desire, but it's also a part of dehumanization.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And actually about that quote from Maya, I quoted it, but like I'm not 100% sure I fully agree with her, because I used to think that way in the sense that I used to look to maybe like cis women and be like, well, men are treating cis women in a different way, and it's a more I don't know, prestige way. What I've learned through experience, I think, is it depends what men you're talking about. Like, men are individuals. There are men that treat women like people, and there are men that don't. And the reality is that my experience and the lens of like a more mature adulthood is that the men that were keeping me secret or treating me like that, like, I wouldn't want to be their cis woman partner either. Like, do you know what I mean? Like they don't see their cis women partners as human. Like, it's a different way of seeing a woman as an extension of yourself. Like, realistically, the sort of man that's like going to be a decent partner to any woman is going to be a decent partner to like all women. And if you have a separate category of sub-woman, then, you know, you're not a decent partner to the woman that happens to have the most socially acceptable form of your desire.
It's sort of like a Madonna whore thing. Like,
yeah.
Like, one of the things I always say is that all women are perceived in proximity to and in relation to sex work. All women. Like, you guess what? You never get to be the Madonna. Like, it's so easy for you to become the whore like that. And so, that, you know, that speaks to that category of sub-woman. There's a lot of Lana Del Rey in this book.
There's like, what's not loads? There's like
there's a fair bit of Lana in there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of like why?
Yeah, like the cis woman transsexual, as I always call her, because there's something. She's like there's certain cis women that are like very trans woman coded, and she's one of them. Yeah, well the reason that the reason that she's in the book, for people that haven't read it, I should explain.
It's not just like, well, I really like her. I really like her music.
The reason that she's in the book, right, is like, well, one, there is just the factual fact that her album Norman fucking Rockwell I listened to a lot after my breakup with this particular significant ex that the book begins with. And it's one of those things that when you listen to an album obsessively during a breakup, you map your own experience onto it. But the reason that I was interested in her is there is a certain type of like gay man and straight woman that seems to be obsessed with Lana Del Rey. And as I sort of touch on in the book, it's the idea that the way that in her early work, men are spoken about, is it's like this fantasy of like this retrograde Americana, like rugged masculinity that she uses as a way to create a self that's completely like like it's like men aren't, like men aren't people, they are gods on motorbikes, and that actually that's not like that. This like idea of abandoning yourself, I find very interesting, because I think that is something that anyone who has to contend with femininity has to contend with. Like the singer Anoni, I remember her in a Guardian interview once talked about her song Drone Bomb Me, and she said about how it's almost like a feminine act of defense to sort of submit and say, go on, hit me then, because it's like you have no alternative. So the kind of strength is to surrender. And that tension is there in femininity. And I think Lana Del Rey's early work like very much focuses on that. And then by the time she gets to Norman fucking Rockwell that I talk about in the book, it's this kind of like sense of like an elegy for that dream. It's like men are really, really disappointing. And then like the lead song of that album is like, I'm with this like self-involved artist and it's terrible, but like, I'm not going to leave. and I honestly think quite a lot of straight women in their 30s do that.
I suppose because I quite like Lana Del Rey. I quite like Lana Del Rey, but like she's not my like North Star. No. Do you know what I mean? Like my North Star is actually all rappers with PTSD. Like that's absolutely my North Star. But I was thinking about what I like about Lana Del Rey, and then the thing which doesn't land for me is that what I like is that there is this sort of imaginative dress up of like sexy woundedness, and that thing of like, I will become abject and I will degrade myself before you. It allows me to access that part of my desire and romantic experience. But the thing where I'm like, you don't get the full 360 degree of men. Like you don't get it. Like they're violent or indifferent or selfish or absent. But men are also goofy as fuck. Like I live with 2 straight men, and it's like living with stoned dogs in a way which I really, really like. Yeah. And there's something about, I guess, the way in which a lot of the, culture that, straight women and gay men consume, which just makes heterosexual men so much more powerful than they are. Yeah. And actually what's great about hanging out with straight men is like the goofiness that comes with. No one's more goofy than a straight man.
I agree. And they're the biggest gossips. I think, no, I mean, I agree with you. I just conclude a different thing is that I think the interesting thing there is it's a fantasy of men. And actually, there's like I could give countless examples of lyrics, but there's like a Lana Del Rey song, Off to the Races, where she talks about he likes to watch me in the glass room, perfume, like cognac, something like that. And the point being is that
she's always taking her red dress off or putting her red dress on.
But that's the point. It's about it's the self is like, who am I when a man is looking at me? So the man is like, it's dehumanizing of men, right? Like it isn't seeing men in their full like subjectivity. It's a complete, it's a complete project. It's using men as a lyrical prop. I really do believe that. So I don't think that she's like an authority on men. She's an authority on like a particular kind of fantastical, delusional, feminine need for men. That I think the reason that was interesting is particularly like in, the sort of neo-feminist kind of millennial pink, Hillary Clinton, The Wing, Beyonce, self-titled feminism of like 10, 15 years ago, was that it was one of the few pop cultural touch points of someone like talking about that, because there's something deeply alienating about having to just need to empower yourself around men as well. Like that idea of like, oh, I don't need men. I think that can be like, very difficult psychologically to take on for a lot of women. And I think in more serious feminism too, like it's interesting when I was researching the book, I was trying to find feminist writing from women who were straight, because it's really difficult to write about like, what, if you still want to shag men, like what do you do in a patriarchy? Like what do you do? Because like you've either got the option of I've got to find one of the good ones, or you're dealing with this kind of restlessness that's just, like that men aren't changing fast enough.
So I want to channel my inner Tim Stanley for a second. So like, very conservative, Catholic. And I think what he would say is something along the lines of, well, look, all of this belly aching is because you're pursuing love without God and without children. Yeah. And the things which give relationships, I guess, a sense of perspective, a sense of what they can't deliver, a sense of groundedness and purpose, it's God and it's children. And you write a lot about your own relationship with religion in this book. Like, is there a part of you which, here's this imaginary Tim Stanley that I've conjured and goes, well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Probably there is a partial agreement there, right? Like the word God is very loaded, right? So like, but let's talk about like spirituality. The loss of a spiritual dimension of love is something that like I wasn't planning, when I first signed the book deal, I was not planning to write about God in this book. And as it happens, I do. Partly because a lot of great works on love, like C.S. Lewis, even Bell Hooks writes about spirituality, because it's the missing piece. And I do believe it's missing. Like, that like secular consumer capitalism is very bleak. And I felt there was a missing dimension to my life. And like, as I have a kind of, certainly like taken on a new belief in my case in God, but like in spirituality particularly, I do think that there is a spiritual function of love. Like, I think there is a sort of grain of truth in the fact that sometimes our fantasies of love are deeply selfish. Like, I think there's something in Sally Rooney's novel Intermezzo where she talks about like there's not the like desire is the most selfish thing of all. I mean, it kind of is true, and it's this idea that like through sex and love we self-optimize, and it's about like we buy things in order to be sexier or to be more lovable, and then it's all about filling ourselves. And a lot of spiritual traditions and religious understandings of marriage, love, or whatever are like, actually, that's an opportunity to be of service to another person. That's an opportunity to grow spiritually with that person and to facilitate that person's growth. And actually,
that the love of self-sacrifice.
Yeah. That like, yeah. Essentially, that you like that like forgiveness is part of love, and that service to another is part of love. And I think, that's difficult too, because I think women have probably historically borne the brunt of that kind of belief system. But I don't think it's like a bad one. I don't think it's a bad model.
Tell that to Jesus up there on the cross. He's like, oh, what am I, chopped liver?
But like, do you get what I'm saying? Yeah. Is that like, I think I mean, I don't know if this is your experience, right? Like, I know that I just read your piece about how your decision to get married, right? Like that it might seem a little bit anachronistic or strange for someone with your politics, but essentially some of those answers, some of those reasons you gave were quasi-spiritual, right? It's about community and about the idea that like a romantic love bond is about more than the two people in it. It's about something greater, and it's about greater ideals. And I do think that has often been surrendered. And so like that part of it, sure, I just think women should be able to get divorced, and you don't have to believe in God. Yeah.
I mean, like, I think when it comes to my own views about marriage, I think the fact that getting married and losing my stepdad happened so quickly, I was like, oh, I have experienced the beginning of a marriage and I've witnessed the end of it. And I've witnessed the end of a marriage, which is the version you sign up for. Like Till Death Do Us Part, like saw that up close, and I was like, wow, there is nothing romantic about this whatsoever. There's nothing romantic about this. There is not, some kind of great sweep of strings and like cellos which are going to come in, and yet this is the most meaningful thing I've witnessed in my life, which is those promises made between my mum and my stepdad, and what they meant at that moment of dying. And so I think there's a bit in the book where you talk about this relationship, and it's like, I found myself thinking that like if he died, I wouldn't want to live. I wouldn't want to live either. And I was like, I think that about my husband all the time. And I go like, if you died, I wouldn't want to live another day. Like I wouldn't want to. And people feel that about their children, right? But like my mum's like, if anything bad ever happened to you or your sister, like I would die. And I was like, okay, no pressure, mum. Like, I guess the thing is like, is that just a sort of like stupid, drunken infatuation thought? Or is that actually the soul of love? This thing of like, I don't think I can live without you.
Well, the reality is that people do live without people all the time, and people go on. I think like the thought is natural, I think, because we're human beings. Like it's fucking hormones, isn't it? Like we deeply attach to people, and that's part of being a social animal. And I don't think that there's anything foolish about that. I think where I talked about with my ex, like, thinking about like if he died, I would want to die. The reality is we're not together anymore. He's married. I'm still alive. Do you know what I mean? Like, but the point being is like, I guess it's like that instinct. What I was talking about there is that instinct to love is like, that's great. But then there is a point where you have to like make a choice, and love is something that you wake up and decide to do. And in that case, I realized for various reasons, I couldn't wake up every day and decide to continue doing it. So the impulse had to be allowed to wither away. So I don't think it's a stupid infatuation or anything like that. But I think it's very real and probably quite valuable, but only valuable insofar as what it motivates us to do, and also recognize that that's still quite selfish, right? Like it's fundamentally probably we'd have to keep going for other people. We don't get to like throw ourselves, we don't get to be like Dido throwing ourselves on like a like a pyre of like our shared possessions.
Yeah, I was going to say Dido, Queen of Carthage, not Dido like thank you.
Yeah, a white flag. Yeah, and the same thing with motherhood, right? Like again, like there's a sort of page of the chapter about motherhood that begins, and people keep putting it on Instagram, and I'm like, I hope it's within the context, but I talk about all the reasons I don't want to be a mother. And what I try to do there
don't want to be a mother or don't want to have children, because I think those are different things.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, like, certainly don't want to have children. But what I do in that passage is I basically try and do this like inverted paean to motherhood, or like homage to motherhood, which is like the reasons that I actually don't want to be a mother in the traditional way with my children is partly because of I know that what the demands of motherhood are. And so one of the things I say is I will never suffer the terrible nightmare of seeing my child die or live forever fearing it. Like that is somewhat, for a vast majority of mothers, probably somewhat of the condition of being a parent. And like, I mean, that serves like a very real primal purpose, right? I don't think I've struggled, honestly. I read a lot about family abolition, and I actually do understand a lot of the political arguments around family abolition, but I think why it doesn't often connect for people is it can feel very devoid. When people think about their own loving bonds in their life, it's like, well, we do attach like a huge amount of transcendent spiritual importance to these feelings, and like great art is made out of it. And the idea that we can only analyze and deconstruct it, I think, leaves a lot of people feeling cold. Now, I don't think necessarily families or family structures need to be ordered the way they are now. Like, families are deeply abusive for some people and deeply like a huge site of pain. And like, I'm trans, right? Like, I'm in a community where lots of people, their family of origin is not a loving place. But I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think what I conclude in the mother chapter in particular, right, is like you just touched on, is okay, the privatization of this sort of form of intense love is probably not a good thing. But like the model of like self-sacrifice and extending yourself for another person is something that like I feel in my dotage, in my late 30s, I find myself doing more and more. Like I find it doing it with younger trans women. I find myself doing it like in my recovery communities with people who are, you know, new to sobriety and need like advice or whatever. I find that kind of idea of like that sort of love very generative, and I'm using that word intentionally. Like it's something that I think has value.
Because you write about Michelangelo's Pieta, which is in St. Peter's Basilica. And I remember going to Rome with my mom when I was about 9, and she was stood in front of that statue for so long. And part of it is like, obviously, great work of art and feeling transported by it. But I think the other was, you know, I don't want to be like, as a mother, but like there was something so profound for her as a mother to see this image of the Virgin Mary holding her child. And the thing that I remember her talking about again and again was the curve of Christ's foot and the sort of, it's so relaxed. And she was like, that's what babies do when they sleep. And it's like this adult man's foot. And I think that for some people, that fear of your child dying or living with that fear is a reason not to do it, like not to have a child. For my mum, she had to deal with actually the idea of my sister dying many times in our childhood, and even now, like that fear becomes so real when my sister is in hospital. But I don't think she would say, I wouldn't want to do it. I think she's like, I experience this profound fear of loss because I have something which is more worth having than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I don't think, I think, again, it's something I touch on in the book, is that I don't think there's a rational reason why I don't want children. I talk about that briefly. I'm like, I'd love to dress it up as like, well, I'm just so afraid of them dying, or it's because of the climate crisis or whatever. And it's like, that's not true. Like, you know, I take flights. Like, realistically, I you know, there are ways in which I, like everyone, am somewhat limited in my principles, right? Like if I really wanted a child, I'd probably have arguments for why. So it's not necessarily about that. It's interesting you talk about the Pieta because...
Am I saying it wrong? Is it Pieta?
I think it's, I don't know. What did you say? Pieta?
I say Pieta.
I think it's both, but I think it's whatever. Like maybe I'm being pretentious. We're both going to have neurosis. We'll cut. Like, we can both dub the other. No, the sculpture, right, is like... in that, like, Mary does hold Christ like he is a baby. And again, like, Michelangelo actually kind of throws the proportions off. Like, she's way too big. Like, if they were both stood upright, she'd be like twice his height. And so it's like, but I think that's like an interesting metaphor, right, for the fact that that's an idealized version of motherhood. And one of the things I grapple with, right, like we've talked a lot, I hope I've like expressed that I do have a lot of time for motherhood. I have a lot of like understanding of like, you know, I'm not someone that wants to dismiss motherhood. At the same time, what I talk about there is that Catholic model of motherhood that, like, certainly like the women in my family had, you know, like it's an impossible ideal, right? Like in that sculpture, Mary is like young, even though she would be in her late 40s. She's so massive that she can hold her adult 33-year-old son like he's a baby. Her face is very calm and stoic, even though this would be the worst thing that's ever happened to her. It's this impossible ideal that, like, the Catholic Church is very obsessed with women and motherhood, and the Marian reverence is a huge part of that. But, like, yeah, the reality is that the religious and particularly Christian ideas of motherhood, but like institutional ideas of motherhood as well, like, let's not like get it twisted, they can also be like deeply reactionary and harmful. You know, like I mentioned Anita Bryant, R.I.P., who died recently, who was a huge anti-gay campaigner in the 1970s, and all of her like rhetoric was like as a mother, I don't, like as a mother, I'm speaking as a mother with concern about the homosexuals. A lot of like current anti-trans rhetoric, like there was a reason why like a website like Mumsnet was like a hub of it, was that there was this like reactionary appeal to protecting children. The idea of motherly love for like can be very pernicious when it comes to like racism, when it comes to homophobia, transphobia. And so,
or it's invoked in a particular way.
Yeah, invoked like this idea of a particular kind of motherhood, and but it's very potent, right? Like because it's playing on something real, which is good. Is that people want to protect their children, but obviously, like the protection of children has deeply reactionary, particularly the protection of white children, has very reactionary, like historical precedents. It's something that. We have to be like not too sentimental about when it's applied politically. There's a lot of studies to show that like talking to women as mothers can be a huge recruitment tool for the far right. Like we've just seen it with Trump, like that so many women voted for Trump, and it's like, why? And I think that, it's motherhood and the understanding of like traditional family life and your role as a mother and the protection of your children. These are noble things, but I also think they can be exploited politically, and I hope that in the book I've kind of tried to talk about the nuances of that without coming down. Even though I've personally come down against having children, I'm not trying to be down certainly on like women who do.
What role does love play in forming political community?
Well, it's an interesting point, right? Like it's something again that I wanted to explore because I loved this idea, like this like really nostalgic comradeship on the left. But honestly,
the red flag is like playing faintly in the background.
This idea, there's a chapter in the book about friendship, and I say that like ultimately friend love is something that's so undervalued. But when you're past your early 20s, I think in heteronormative culture, yet for me, friend love relations are the primary love. At this point in my life, they are the ones like if I would want to be like remembered in terms of my friendships, not unfortunately, even though I've written about loads of them, my romantic or sexual relationships, like they've been the ones, the site of most growth and nourishment. And I feel like that's always devalued. Now, like whether or not that maps on perfectly to politics, I talk a bit about some of the friendships I had in my 20s and about how my politics shifted from quite like a sort of center-left position because I just made friends with like a bunch of like unhinged and crazy queer socialists or whatever. And I sort of talk about and I talked about how like I talk in the book about like, which I do think is important too, is that I shifted a lot politically, partly because I realized like, oh, hey, I'm a trans person. Turns out like I might have come from quite like a sort of lower middle class white family, but like turns out the state, capitalism, I actually have more of an antagonistic relationship with these because of my own life. So I woke up to that, but like also I shifted in my politics because of like conversations with friends, and they weren't scolding and they weren't necessarily like on a panel or what we're doing now. They were usually like late at night at a party. A lot of like conversation that probably was not so fruitful as well at that time. But like the point being is that like certainly like friendship and politics for me are intimately bound, and I think they should be. But I also think like love in terms of politics, like I think like it depends on what we mean by love, because I think what can be really difficult, right, is that we naturally like in a lot of like our friendships, our partners, even our family, there is a sense of we cleave to people who mirror us. And the problem we have with like leftist politics is that we have to start like thinking about how we engage with people who we do not love.
Well, I mean, this sort of, I guess, brings me back to secularism, right? It's a very secular idea of love, that love is a mark of discernment, right? And who you love and who you don't love is a mark of, is a sort of demonstration of your ability to discern between something good and something bad. So I love you and I don't love you because you're good and you're bad. Like, it's a very secular idea. Whereas ideas of religious love are meant to be a lot more universal. It's like, you are supposed to fucking love everybody.
Yeah.
Like, sure, you don't. The church certainly didn't, but like that's what you're meant to do.
Yeah, well, I'm a recovering alcoholic, right? And like the reality is in a lot of recovery communities or whatever, that's what you're encouraged to do, and you're encouraged to not, you know, like that you come in and you might be like, I don't want to talk to all these people, whatever, like, and you're encouraged to form like relationships with other people in recovery, right? Because you can't really recover alone. And that's almost got a spiritual element to it, in the sense that probably like, yeah, but if I hadn't, wound up in recovery in my early 30s, like I ended up being really helped. Some of the people that have probably like helped me the most, I don't want to know how they vote. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, you know, like West London, soft Tories. Like, I'm sure I can imagine, right? And so, like, it's a different lens on which to view like love and help. And it's like, you know, I'm never going to set aside my political principles. And I have, you know, like there have been friendships that have not survived political difference. You know, I think a lot of us probably in the last like 15 months in particular have had that experience. And so like there are always going to be lines, right? But I think a recovery of kind of a spiritual idea of love has definitely shifted my attitudes towards people that like, if I'm being prejudiced about someone, that's actually a problem that centers in me. And like contempt before investigation is not a good thing. And I think actually a lot of like leftist subcultures, for very good reasons, we're quite embattled, do sort of like encourage or incubate we've often like, especially like in queer communities, been treated very badly. But I try on a personal level to challenge myself to reach outside of that. But I also think like politically we have to do that. And it's really difficult. I don't have the answer for like, what's the difference between that and pandering? It's something I'm still working out, because at the same time, I see arguments all the time by like cis male leftists about how, like we need to bring people along, and they're just saying transphobic shit. And I'm like, you know, actually I don't know that this is necessarily like building useful alliances across aisles. I actually think it like is somewhat surrendering or like dissolving bonds of solidarity with people who really need it, and weaker parts. So it's a difficult balance. And
I guess maybe one of the things you're hinting at is that like there is a lower tolerance for contradiction, tension, like real difficulty in political spaces than in our interpersonal ones. I mean, like, you know, you just sort of say like, I don't want to know how the people who really supported me vote, but it's like, look at my own family. I'm like, oh, fucking hell. Like, and yet I still am forced into proximity with you. And that means that I have to learn to love you because you're here. And, you know, for the people who I've known for a very, very long time, like, you know, I'm still friends with people who were my best friends when I was like 11. It's like, you have to be elastic in that. Whereas if I was to think about like how I draw the boundaries of political community, that feels both like more rigid and brittle than that sort of like flexible way of interacting with people in this other aspect of life. I mean, does that ring true at all?
Yeah, it does ring true. And I guess what I'm interested in is like, to what extent can one be transposed onto the other? Because I don't think it's an easy fit. And I think it can sound very new agey and a bit woo-woo to be like politics of love. Because also the difficulty too is like the relationship between love and justice, right? Like I think one of the things that I touch on it when I talk about spirituality and my I talk in the chapter on spirituality about forgiveness. I actually think forgiveness I read so much messaging now about how you don't need to forgive, and I find that quite strange. But like, it is difficult, right, when it comes up against like there are very public transphobes, right, who are making mine and my friend, like, and particularly some of my friends' lives like harder. Like they're having real political impact. Like they are winning, and these people do not see me as fully human. Like they don't, and nothing I can do, no matter how nice I am, no matter how coherent and how respectful my arguments back are, because I've been doing that kind of line of work for a long time. They hate me. They don't see me as a human being, full stop. And it's like, I still have realized that for me, sanity comes from like at least letting go at a certain level. But how does that not become like inertia where you just accept injustice? And the balance between accepting that there is real harm being caused and there is real injustice, and that like it's not always okay to just put your hands up and be like, well, I'll turn the other cheek. Like,
I was going to say turn
balance,
the other cheek, but I only have two.
Yeah, exactly. But then like that's the incoherence, like, sorry to Christians watching, but like in the Gospels, right? Like Christ says both, I'll turn the other cheek, but I came here to bring a sword, not peace. You know, like there's a duality in how Jesus Christ, as he appears in the Gospels, talks about justice, this like the sword of justice, and like turning the cheek of like for forgiveness and love. And so like, you know, that tension is there, and I think that's part of the human condition. So to answer your question, like, yes, it does mirror my experience. I mean, yeah, I think for me it's like, how do I view my political life in a way that's not through just the lens of friendship. Like friendship is what's so magical about friendship, right, is it's probably, when you compare it to like family love, which is like tribal and you're raised in it, and romantic love, which like there has to be deep compatibility for it to survive. Like the good thing about friend love is it's a bit more chill. It's like it's elective. Like you choose in general, like there are Aristotelian models of friendship. Like some are like deeply effective and some are like we just like doing the same stuff together. But like friendship's like, it's ad hoc. It arises like because both people want to be involved for the most part.
What about comradeship?
Well, this is the thing, right? What's the difference? And I think the problem is, right, is that friendship is about like wanting to do it, whereas comradeship, I think, is about serving a higher aim. And it actually has to mean that you have to perhaps even like sort of suppress or sublimate some of your discomfort. Like, and some people might dislike that idea. But
thinking about the will to love, is there not like a will to love in comradeship? There's more, you know, Jodie Dean writes about some of the values of what it means to live as a communist. And she doesn't just talk about like, you know, kindness, generosity. She's like, revolutionary discipline is important. Like having a strong sense of will is sort of central to this.
Yeah, it's yes, I think so. But then it's interesting talking about theoretically, isn't it? Because it's so, again, it's such an intimate question, because what is the line, for throwing this out there, between like this revolutionary discipline and then kind of a sort of foolish tribal loyalty. And there are many political movements that have also like imploded because of that, right? Like because they take on a bunker mentality, which particularly on the left is a real issue, because it's like when you feel besieged, it's really hard to
protect
have,
the ideology.
Yeah, it's really hard to have this generous, because love is supposed to be open, and it's really hard, particularly like now, I think, for anyone like on the left to maintain that sense of openness. But I see it like I think in trans communities, I think sometimes like, unfortunately, some of the meanest, nastiest things that I've ever seen or read about trans women come from trans women, and that's like, it's that like it's rooted in fear, right? Like it's that like this idea that, you know, if this person's early in their transition and is going on TV, they're not representing us well enough, you know, like all of that stuff, because it comes from this deep anxiety of like a bunker mentality. And like, you know, I definitely think like I talk as well a little bit in the book too. Like I think I mentioned cancel culture. I'm glad I didn't get too into it in the book, because I think cancel culture's over. I think like cancellation's over. Like
cancel's cancelled.
Yeah, cancellation's cancelled. But like, you know, this idea of like, it's been talked to death, but like censoriousness on the left and people feeling scolded or whatever. Like I talk about it not as the victim of it. I try and talk about it as a bit like the perpetrator or the person that did it, because I know I used to do it, right? Like when I was younger, I would do the angry, like I have deep regrets about some of the like angry Facebook statuses I did about individuals. I have like, you know, in some cases I've apologized to people directly. And like some of that's youth and some of that and self-righteousness. But like I it's something that, and perhaps maturity and world experience, the gray areas of life, you realize that. But I think, I also just think I understand where it came from in me, but I do think we have to challenge ourselves to that, like, to openness. And so like, I agree with the point of discipline, but I think it has to be like, I think generosity is a word that like we have to talk about. And it's really unfair. That's like, if you probably come to the left wing and for whatever reason, class background, sexuality, ethnic background, like you probably are like, why do I have to be fucking generous to people that like, like the dominant group that like potentially could be swayed to vote for things that are going to like hurt me.
I mean, I think that like maybe I felt that way in my 20s, and now I just feel like, well, life is a long out. Like who told you life wasn't going to be a long out? It is a long out, and it's a numbers game. And like, if you're on the side with small numbers, you don't get to be hostile because you'll lose. I think I've got one last question, and I guess it's about the writing of this book. I mean, you talked about how in relationships there's that compulsion to repeat, to try and change the ending by doing the same thing again.
Yeah.
Through writing this book, have you managed to change your relationship to love or change the ending at all?
Well, there's a postscript at the end of the book that I wrote in haste before it went to print, because whilst I was writing the book, I had a kind of mini heartbreak situation, and
You're like, not this shit again!
Yeah, I felt fucking mental, and I was like, well, I haven't learned anything about heartbreak. Like that's just part of being alive. Turns out, what I did learn, is the book is also dedicated to my friend Maria, who died whilst I was writing it. She was a friend from university, and she died of acute myeloid leukemia within 5 months of diagnosis. And I saw her a couple of days before she died in the ICU. She wasn't married and she didn't have children. And there was a time where I visited her in hospital, and she was talking about like, she didn't have a partner at the time she was diagnosed. She didn't have children. And she was kind of like, well, if anything, I'm probably getting more love and care from friends than if I was dependent on like one partner. And we had this quite like light-hearted conversation about it. But like even bearing witness to something like that, like I put that as the dedication of the book, because seeing a group of friends, essentially like the nurse in ICU told me they'd never seen so many visitors for one person, because like ICUs are really depressing. People tend to stay away. And like the fact that all of us kind of like seeing also like my other friends and the things that like, it's a group of like people that like aren't super therapized, talking about our feelings the whole time. It's like like it's that kind of group, right? Like we like, and then like we're forced into earnestness for a brief period before resuming dark jokes after. And like realizing like bearing witness to something like that, like fundamentally changes like your view of love too, which is like, how foolish would it be for me to complain when like I'm getting no matches on Hinge that I'm interested in, like I'm gonna die alone, when like you literally witness that like love doesn't really work that way, and that love is kind of already here in your life, like wherever you choose to place it, and putting like romantic love on this pedestal is probably a bit foolish. I guess like beyond that, like it made me realize in general, like I've talked about heartbreak, I talked about grief, is like love is intimately bound to loss. You can't over intellectualize it. Like part of like both my books, right, is like one of my coping mechanisms, and I wouldn't be surprised if this resonates for you, like is like intellectually grappling with things that like at the emotional level I'm not fully comfortable with yet.
100% that, and watching repeats of Sharp.
Yeah.
Like anything during the Napoleonic Wars, I'm like, I'm in fucking mental trouble. Bam, Sean Bean.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think like the point, what I learned about love is like, it's not, I can't think my way out of these problems. Like love isn't, you will lose. Like to love is to lose, right? Like you either lose through bereavement, or you lose because people don't stay around forever. And that like place of fear is something that you actually just have to sit with, that reality that the flip side of love is always going to be loss, or the fear of loss. And what I realized writing the book, like what has changed, I guess, was that I wrote this book and realized like, oh, hey, I can't intellectualize this. Like I am going to continue. This is going to continue to be a dynamic, living, breathing thing that I am going to have to go out and make mistakes with again. And I slapped that postscript on basically because I was like, in this book tour, people are going to like, I'm going to have audience questions that are going to frame me as an expert on love. And I'm going to be sat there feeling like an imposter, quite rightly, because I'll know that I'll be like pranging about someone hasn't texted me, or or like sat there just being like, whatever. Like hopefully getting into at some point, like I'm not done with romantic love. I say it's decentralized in my life and has been. And partly as a process, part of the process of writing the book was I decentralized it because it's really hard to date when you write a book like that at the same time, turns out. But yeah, I guess like the crux of what I've learned is, like the good thing about love and loss is that like you're still fucking alive. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's basically how the book ends, is that like there's always the chance to start again. Like love is not something that's ever like a final destination. It's an ongoing practice throughout our lives, and it will continue past where the final page of the book is.
Well, that seems like a really beautiful place to wrap up. Shon Faye, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thank you for having me. Gosh, that put me through my paces.